The godswood of Winterfell breathed in slow, frosted whispers, every bough dimly alive with the weight of ice and the hush of old, patient watching. Beneath the face carved in the heart tree, its eyes crusted red with frozen sap, Jon Snow stood with his gloved hands bare, fingers aching against the air that gnawed to the bone. Ghost moved like a pale thought among snow-hung roots, padding close enough that Jon could feel the animal's steady heat through his boots. The wolf's breath fogged and dissolved in the candleless twilight, leaving nothing but the faint crunch of paws and the faraway murmur of forges in the castle yard. He did not pray, not yet. He listened. Wind worried the high needles and combed the leafless tangles that had crept toward the sacred tree before the first kings ever put crowns to their heads. There was a rhythm in it, a kind of rough counting, the way waves count stone at a shore. Northmen said the old gods counted too. They counted words and deeds and debts unpaid. He had brought them plenty to tally. A bastard's promises, a brother's lies for the sake of peace, a lover's truth deferred until later, after the fight, after the winter fell away. He laid his palm to the heart tree and felt the bark bite. When he spoke, his voice did not seem to travel far. The snow took each syllable and folded it, put it away. "Look at me," he said to the carved face. "If you're there, if you remember my father, or the men he called father." The gouged eyes watched the small steam of his words. Ghost leaned his weight against Jon's hip in a silent nudge. The wolf had no patience for talk stretched thin. He wanted the scent of blood and decision, and what lay between. "I would wager everything," Jon said. "The whole of the living, on a line no wider than my blade is thick." He didn't say the name of the one he meant to challenge. Names bind, names call, but the godswood had no need of such calling. The cold deepened, not much, just enough to make the sap-grimed tears at the weirwood's mouth beat harder into red glass. Somewhere past the wall of dark trunks, a raven croaked a warning that froze halfway into silence, as if a hand had closed around its throat. Jon thought of his father's words, not Eddard's, but the man whose gentleness had shaped him nonetheless. That when the time came to pass the sentence, you swing the sword yourself. The old law was not just for deserters or thieves. It was a law of intimacy. If you would be the cause, you would be the tool. He had pushed others between the teeth of winter enough times. Now he would stand himself in their place. He closed his eyes and felt for the quiet he used to find when the world narrowed to the length of Longclaw's reach. The human mind has a way of multiplying outcomes until the will itself grows thin. The old gods, if they were not just wind and memory, might respect someone who brings them a single, cleave choice. Snow whispered loose from the highest branches and fell in a sudden hiss, powdering his shoulders. He stepped back from the tree and flexed the numbness out of his fingers. Ghost paced to the godswood's arch and held there, waiting, ears pricked toward the keep where torchlight painted the ice in strokes of amber. Jon took the path slow. He wanted the cold to set his thinking, like iron in water. By the time he reached the stone stair that wound up to Winterfell's great hall, the forge music he had heard in the distance became a full, throbbing heartbeat of hammer and anvil. Dragonglass stank when it met the coals. Metal sang when it softened. Work would go on through the night. They measured hours by the height of sparks. Inside the hall, heat when it hit his face felt foreign, like hands laid too sudden on a wound. Shadows flickered large on high-beamed ceilings. They had dragged long tables closer to the hearths and moved benches so that people faced one another, not the fire, as if reminding themselves that warmth came from company as much as wood. Sansa sat near the center with her back straight, sewing a torn glove for a boy who watched her hand without blinking. The boy's face was raw with wind and youth that had not learned to be careful. When Sansa tied off the thread and slipped the glove back over his fingers, she smiled in a way that was not a smile exactly, just a softening around the eyes that made the boy breathe easier. She caught Jon watching and inclined her head. The needle between her fingers flashed and vanished. Tyrion and Davos studied a sheaf of charcoal marks mapped across a flattened deerskin. Brienne stood beside the table, the moon-pale plate of her armor shedding wet in tiny rivulets. When Jon entered, Tormund turned from a flagon, mouth already opening to send some joke across the room. but the words fell away when he saw Jon's face. "Lord Snow," Davos said, voice roughened by smoke, "you have the look of a man who's found the hinge on which a bad door might swing, or else fall clean off." Jon set his gloves by the fire to thaw. He did not sit. He let his eyes travel to Daenerys, where she stood tense and bright, speaking in a low voice with Missandei and Grey Worm. The queen's hair gleamed with frost melt like a crown of glass threads. When she felt his gaze, she lifted her chin a little in question and came. "You've been with the gods," she said softly. It wasn't quite an accusation. She had learned the North's grammar. A man returns from trees with a plan or a wound. "With what fills them," Jon said. "It's time to ask for something we've never had." Tyrion folded the map. "You say that as if we haven't been conducting a masterclass in impossibility since we first agreed to stand under the same roof." Sansa's needle paused above the leather. "What do you mean to ask?" Jon looked at Bran, who had been so still on the far bench that Jon had not noticed him at first. It would be easy to mistake the boy for a figure carved of pale wood and midnight oils. The small prints of the heart tree made flesh, but the turn of Bran's mouth broke the illusion. Some ancient joke seemed to live in him, amused and unslept. Beside Bran, Theon Greyjoy sat taut as a bowstring. He watched Jon with a kind of painful hope, like a man waiting to be allowed a proper place to die. "Old ways," Jon said. "Older than the first kneelings. Older than steel. The man who commands death can be called to answer for it." Tormund chuffed, delighted. "A challenge, then. Man to man. Man to whatever he is," Brienne said. Tyrion eased onto a bench and poured wine he did not drink. "And what if the whatever refuses? You can't shame ice." Sam entered with an armful of books hugged to his chest, hair gone wild from the steam that rose from the baths. His breath plumed. "Some things that are old don't understand refusal. They understand form. There are records, half legend, granted, of the first men and the children putting quarrels to the sword of one champion, bound by words under trees like ours. The language is more gesture than syllable, but the grammar is real. The old gods attend, and if they attend, the others attend." Missandei's eyes warmed with curiosity. "You are saying there is a law of the forest that even these creatures will obey?" "Obey is the wrong word," Bran said, finally blinking. His voice was winter slow and unhurried. "They are made of a law. They are its memory moving. They cannot neglect it any more than a river can forget its own bed." Daenerys' gaze ran across the faces of her advisors, bounced off their worry and their hunger and the thinness of their patience, and returned to Jon. "You mean to offer yourself?" Jon felt the knot in his stomach loosen as soon as he spoke the words he had been shaping. The body signals the truth sometimes before the mind consents. "Yes. Noise happens different in a hall. Even nods are loud." Sansa's sewing hand tightened without puncturing flesh or leather. Davos set both palms on the table as if steadying it. Tyrion's mouth softened from cleverness into something almost tender. "You can't," Arya said, and Jon startled. He hadn't seen her approach. She stood at his shoulder like a ghost in dark leathers, face unreadable except for the brightness in her eyes. "You mustn't pay him the courtesy of making you equal." "It's not courtesy," Jon said. "It's the only number that adds. If I lose, you have what you have now. One last battle to throw the bones on. If I win." "If you win," Sansa repeated very quietly. "The dead fall, like the snows after a thaw," Bran said. "Fast, then slow in the shade, and in the dark places nothing ever thaws. But most would fall." His eyes unfocused, then sharpened, a bird of prey returning to the hand. "He will agree." "How can you say?" Dany began. "Because I have been where he is," Bran said. "I have touched his storm. He is older than malice and younger than grief, and he wants ending. But not the kind the world wants. He wants to write the ending with his own hand and then lie down in it, and for that he needs a script he cannot refuse. He wants the challenge as a mirror." Daenerys' jaw set. There was a tremor there that Jon had come to know, a vibration that preceded both tenderness and killing. He loved her in that trembling. Then we call him to the yard, she said. And when he comes, we drown him in dragon fire until even the memory of his bones forgets. Sam's books scraped on wood as he set them down. My queen, I don't think dragon fire is. We don't know if it is or isn't, John said, gentling the words so the room did not rip in falling lines. But we know steel that drank old blood can bite them. We saw it bite. He'll bring his screams, Tormund said, meaning the whites. How do we hold from joining in when we hear our dead being driven by him like cattle? We hold because the trees hold, Bran said. If the words are spoken and the circle drawn, the things outside the fight are ghosts until the fight is ended. They'll press against the skin of the world. You'll feel them, but they won't pass. If anyone strikes within the circle who is not named to it, the strike returns to them. Davos scratched at the white seam where old fire had kissed his neck. I prefer swords in the world where they belong, M-Lord. But I have sailed at the edges of men's maps. I've seen enough to stop calling the far shore liar. He sighed. If you're committed, we'll make it proper. Show him we know the form. That counts. The hall moved toward the plan the way water moves toward a drain, slow at first, then with a sudden give. Ser Jorah came in, wetter than Brienne, and listened with that grave half-frown he wore like mail. He did not argue with the logic. He adjusted details. The hound snorted and said if anyone looked like they'd break the circle, he would happily cut their legs off to improve their respect. Gendry asked quiet questions about metal and cold, and whether a grip can freeze if you sweat in your gloves. Meej Mormont's girl, Lyanna, fierce and knife-eyed, announced that if this was to be done, it would be done under northern sight, not in some southern pageant. That made a few men grin despite themselves. Where? Sansa asked. Not in the yard. The weirwood, Bran said, but not beneath it, before it, where the oldest roots watch. Daenerys turned to Missandei, said nothing, and received instead the brief, certain nod of a woman who understood vows spoken in old tongues whether or not she could translate them. The queen touched Jon's hand with her fingers and let them linger. Her skin was so warm that the heat hurt, and he realized how deep the cold had gone into him. We'll do it at dawn, she said, when the night is most itself. Sam dug into the heavy book bound in flaking red leather. He licked a thumb, frowned at himself, and stopped licking. The words, he said. There are so many words, but the shape is plain. The challenger speaks, the tree watches, the snow answers. If the snow answers, the one called comes. If he does not come, the snow refuses. It blows away hard and fast as if something is sweeping the table, and no one can remember the place for a day and a night. And if he comes and cheats? Arya asked. Sam glanced at Bran, who met Arya's gaze with intensity that was almost playful. He cannot cheat, Bran said, and Arya's mouth turned down. Everyone can cheat, she said. He can't, Bran repeated, smile small and sharp now. Not in the place he made. That is the cost of making it. They went out into the Godswood just past the hour when the castle's fires lowered to embers. Torches were left at the arch. Only the pale, unkind moon remained to pour its thin milk through the branches. A dozen men and women came in pairs and then stood apart, instinct drawing them toward the edges of whatever would happen. Davos, Brienne, Tyrion with a flask he did not lift. Tormund, gray ice on his beard like salt. Gilly huddled with the babe against her, Sam just within reach. Theon, hands open as if he would receive a blow. Sansa, wrapped in wolfskin, hair a red banner even by moonlight. Arya sliding sideways into the deeper shadow, her face narrowed to a parenthesis that could open on almost any meaning. Daenerys, erect as a drawn sword, dragons nowhere in sight, and yet the air smelled faintly of hot stone. Jon knelt where the leaves were reddest, where the snow thinned. He said the words Sam had shaped for him from scraps and phonemes. They did not belong in his mouth. They felt like the movements of tools made for other hands, like borrowing a harp and plucking it with fingers calloused for axe handles. The sound they made did not pass straight into night but turned, as if laying its cheek against something invisible and old. Ghost lay down beside him and put his head on his paws. The wolf did not close his eyes. When Jon finished, he placed Longclaw tip down in the snow. The sword's dark ripples drank moonlight and returned nothing but a flat, steady shine, like deep water under ice. The pommel's wolf watched the carved face watch them. For a long breath, there was no breathing but the weak wind. Bran's pupils widened until his eyes were almost all black. He tilted his head, listening to something that had no direction. Sansa's fingers pressed themselves into the wolfskin at her throat and held there. Someone coughed and swallowed the sound. The snow around Longclaw's blade quivered. It did not spiral or drift. It did not lay itself down in the careful, too even way that winter often does when it is being kind. It rose. Not much, an inch, a little more. It rose straight up from the ground in a transparent skin, as if the world itself had taken a sudden inhale and held it. Then, with a hiss that made the hairs on Jon's forearms prick, it peeled back in a perfect circle 5 paces wide, exposing dark, frozen earth, bare and ready. The sound it made was like a wet seam tearing. Bran's mouth shaped yes. Sam's book slid from his hands, hit leather boots, and stopped there. Sansa's eyes lifted to Jon's and filled with a love so naked he wanted to look away. Not because he did not want it, but because he did not deserve it in any way that felt honest. Arya's jaw tightened and she nodded once. But it was a soldier's assent to a fool's necessity. Daenerys let out a breath that shuddered in the unbroken ring. When she turned her face to the heart tree, the red sap looked like the paint a warrior smears before she goes to break something with purpose. When the wind returned, it had changed its tone. Somewhere beyond the walls a horse screamed, thin and long, then stopped with a pop like a sapling cracking under a sudden load. People flinched violently enough that the circle shivered, and did not break. Dawn came as a bruising of the dark. Not light exactly, just less night. Word went through the castle that a parley not named a parley would be held. They moved stacked wood and levered open old gates that had rusted into reluctance. They hauled ropes and hammered in stakes no one would use and lit fires because to leave hearths unlit was to surrender a part of themselves before they had even begun. Davos walked the ring, counting steps, measuring the ground with a sailor's stale patience. Brienne followed him and stabbed markers in the earth with ferocious care, as if the act of marking would itself ward off incursion. Gendry and a knot of smiths brought hot stones in slings to warm Jon's hands. "Don't grip too soon," Gendry said. "You'll sweat. You won't feel it. Then the wind will own you." Tormund arrived with a spear that had the ugly grace of something honed by hunger. "If the dead prick the circle, I'll make them regret ever being alive," he said cheerfully to no one in particular. "The ones with bits left to regret with." Tyrion adjusted nothing that anyone could see and drank not at all. He took notes in his mind and tore them up immediately, and did that all morning. Sansa came with a cloak she had sewn before dawn, its weight practically a house. "Father's pattern," she said, easing it over Jon's shoulders herself. Her hands were steady. "I've amended. There is a little more room at the shoulders for your breath. You hold your breath when you mean to be quiet with your body. This will remind you to take it." "Thank you," he said, and the words felt insufficient and naked, like 2 coins on a dead man's eyes, but they were all he had. Arya came without being seen and then was there. She ran her fingers down the fur at Jon's collar to flatten it at the places a sword might catch. "You used to telegraph with your eyes," she murmured. "You still do. Learn the Night King's rhythm and never meet his first swing with your best parry. He will test to find your truth. Lie to him in little ways until he believes those are your truths. Then show him the real one." He wanted to say a dozen things to her. That the rider bore a spear of ice that made Jon's teeth hurt just to look at. The face behind the crown of horned frost was not a face. It was a smooth plane on which a man's features had once been tried and found wanting. It did not ride all the way. The horse stopped with perfect obedience at the circle's edge. The rider dismounted without lowering itself, more like separating. It took a step forward and the air around the ring throbbed a slow, deep time. The thing did not test the boundary. It knew it. Jon drew Longclaw as if the sword had been waiting for this moment the whole of its made life. The steel woke with a note none of the gathered had ever heard before, a thin, clean thread that cut through the clogged acoustics of the ring and went up into the tree like a prayer said without believing. Jon held the blade in front of him and lowered it to a guard he had learned in Castle Black's yard, when there had been so much future they had had to invent problems to solve. He did not move. He waited. The Night King watched him with no eyes. It held the spear at a cant that was neither offer nor threat. The length of it would eat a man's distance. The point glittered a little with a kind of almond sweetness that was sickening. It looked like it could pierce anything with the same indifference. The creature twisted its wrist, and frost flowed along the haft as if it were alive and being asked to come forward and feed. Jon had expected the first strike to come like lightning. The creature had moved like lightning before, cutting men out of their days with casual, incomprehensible speed. Instead, the Night King stood in the ring and did not move at all. It waited as if for a cue only it could hear. Its stillness was a kind of pressure that made Jon feel sloppy by comparison just for breathing. A crow somewhere outside the gods would cried once, and the sound slid off the boundary of the circle like oil shaken off water. Jon's skin knew then, not his mind, that he and the thing before him stood inside a law whose teeth were sunk too deep to pull out. He put his thumb to Sam's leather and felt the dull edge of obsidian. The Night King moved. It wasn't fast. It was exact in the way Daenerys had named. One step, spear angled as if to touch Jon's shoulder like a lover. Jon pivoted, not away but through the angle, the way a swimmer will knife into a wave instead of lifting over it and letting the next swallow them. Longclaw's flat kissed the spear and slid, their voices meeting in a sound that made hunger rise in Jon's mouth and then vanish. He stepped close enough to smell nothing, which was its own smell, and cut low for the joint where a man's knee would be. The spear dipped with unsentimental grace and took the strike offline. The night did not glow. No great drama spilled into the ring. It was the quietest beginning to a kind of ending Jon had ever imagined. Outside the circle, people forgot to breathe and then remembered all at once. Ghost's feet danced and settled. The weirwood watched everything with its carved sorrow and did not move. They traded shapes more than blows. Jon tried a feint that had worked on men drunk with their own strength. The spear answered, not with disdain but with a refusal to be tricked. He tried the other direction, going at what he supposed must be the creature's offhand. The spear made of itself a hinge and opened him almost to his heart, but not quite. He paid for that question with a line of cold along his ribs that bit through mail like wind through a shirt. He did not bleed, or if he did it was a warmth quickly washed away by a world that wanted everything to be the same temperature. He listened to Arya's voice coming up from memory. Lie in little ways. He let his shoulders clench in a way that suggested fatigue. He let his breath roughen by half a step where it would be reasonable. He was careful not to lay any pattern so regular the thing before him might bother to notice. It noticed enough anyway. It was noticing itself. He could feel it testing its own limits in the frame of ritual, just as he was. The spear wanted the space between his heartbeats. He wanted the space between the creature's blows, if they could be called blows. There was no weight to them in the human sense. They were locations imposed. He tried to cut through the idea of the spear rather than its body, and for a single instant something gave. Longclaw sang like a plucked string, too bright, and frost exploded out from the impact point in a cone that sprayed the inside face of the ring and hissed on the boundary. Outside, men reached for weapons without meaning to. Brienne's hand clamped down on Davos' arm. He hissed and let go of air with a curse that fogged and tore. Daenerys' fingers dug crescents into her palms and came away unblooded. The Night King tilted its head, a fraction. Jon saw in that small inclination more respect than he had hoped to earn and less victory than he could afford. The creature made a small change that would have been unreadable if Jon had not been watching for everything. It adjusted its stance as if acknowledging that the sword facing it was not just metal but an argument. They engaged again. Jon felt the boundary of the ring at his back without looking and rolled along it rather than step onto it. He had the odd sense that if he touched it, if he brushed that unseen skin, parts of him might decide to stop belonging to him. He pressed forward into the opening his roll made and cut for the point where any living thing must decide whether to defend its head or its core. The spear did something that should have been impossible. It became a little shorter without appearing to move, and John's cut bit only emptiness dressed like a plan. The thin line along his ribs burned now, not with heat but with a cold that acted like heat upon memory. Images bubbled up that had no business here. A boy on a wall older than maps. A woman's mouth saying I have chosen. A father's hand on a boy's neck, heavy with pride and warning. He put his thumb to the obsidian again. Present, he thought, and the word came as a small, clean room in which he could stand. The Night King attacked with something like impatience for the first time. It slid low and then reversed, a movement that would have torn a man's shoulder out if a man's shoulder had been anchoring it. John took it on the flat and let the force pass him like the wind that takes a man's cloak but not the man. He saw a thread of opportunity, not wide and committed. He stepped into the ghost of the spear and let Longclaw fall in a tight arc aimed not at limb or weapon but at the empty, absent place on the thing's face where any man's eye would live. The edge met resistance like thick ice on a lake that has known many winters. The sword bit, the bite screamed, the ring's boundary flashed. Not with light, but with more cold. A sudden, searing cold that made men gasp and curse beyond the circle. John pressed, teeth bared. The spear struck his thigh and the world lost depth. It flattened. He staggered and then refused to stagger any further. He had cut something. Not much, but something. A tiny chip of rime turned into a fall of glitter like ground diamond that powdered his boots and the earth before him. Where those grains touched the boundary, they hissed into nothing. The Night King stepped back. It did not bleed, but it regarded him with stillness broken once by the tiniest of shifts, a recalibration. John knew too well the cost of a wound to let himself be drunk with the knowledge that this thing could be cut. He let the pain in his thigh be information. He changed feet, not enough to signal, enough to avoid teaching his enemy how he would compensate. He breathed through his mouth and tasted the clean iron, nothing of the cold. "Come on then," he said softly, and his voice inside the circle belonged to nobody but the two of them. The spear came. Longclaw rose and met it. Steel and ice spoke an old, grinding language together, one of friction and refusal, of shape trying to remain shape under pressure. John felt in that contact a promise he did not understand, and he began, for the first time since stepping into the ring, to believe he was not merely living through the last hour of his life. He was inside a narrative older than either of them, and if he could find the cadence of it, he might be able to lay a different end upon its spine. Outside the circle, the living stood in their ranks not as soldiers but as witnesses. The hound had stopped muttering and stared as if the sight insulted even his cynicism. Grey Worm's face was as still as the stone he had been born under, but his hands flexed once on the haft of his spear as if remembering childhood drills. Theon's breath misted in ragged puffs that had nothing to do with the cold. Sansa stood like a tower with a light in it, her eyes never leaving Jon's. Arya's head moved in small, precise increments as she tracked the angles of spear to sword with a mathematically tender attention. Tyrion's lips moved, counting something and then refusing to count it any further, choosing to watch instead. As for Daenerys, she was a statue carved to be a vessel of fire. There was no heat on her skin, not here. The circle forbade it. But the heat inside her lit her eyes so that when she blinked it seemed as if a forge door opened and closed. Ghost did not whine. He watched, breath evenly spilling and collapsing, tail a pale brush stirring frost into unseen patterns. The second exchange drew blood, not his. Could not be blood, but the word fit the meaning. Jon feinted a drop and struck high, a mirror of his earlier attempt but faster, meaner. The Night King chose to answer the drop, and Longclaw turned that choice into a hairline fracture across the side of the creature's crowned skull. The sound it made was like glass deciding to betray a window. A low, almost animal sound gathered at the edges of the circle in response. The dead giving voice without being allowed to speak. The boundary throbbed once. The weirwood's red tears glittered. The spear's riposte came with more force than before. It lifted Jon off his feet and put him down again a step to the side. not violent enough to break him but firm enough to warn him about pretending to be the only author here. He took the warning and did not waste the fear that came with it. He put the fear beside Sam's obsidian and Arya's advice and Sansa's cloak and Daenerys' exactness and made of them a sort of hearth, small but real. He altered his guard a hair's width. The Night King saw it, committed to eat the mistake. Jon let it eat, and when its hunger moved past the mouth of its plan toward the throat, he brought Longclaw around in a cut that would have been ugly if it had not been so necessary. The blade hit the spear near the head and drove through it not as through ice but as through an idea that had been proven false. The upper third of the spear shattered into a storm of shards that sang as they struck the circle and the ground and then winked out as if they had never been. The Night King stood holding a broken haft that no longer knew what it was. A sound went through the trees, a sound that had no shape until it found human throats to vibrate. Some called it joy, some called it terror becoming noise. Tears froze on cheeks that had been dry a moment earlier. Jon did not cheer. He did not even allow himself the smallest smile. He was too busy trying not to die of the consequences of striking a king's symbol from his hand. The Night King's stillness deepened into something like intent concentrated. The creature reversed its grip and the broken spear became a staff that moved with a terrible economy. Jon's forearm rang where it took a blow he had barely seen. His fingers threatened to open. He told them no, firmly and aloud. They closed. They circled, if it could be called that. Two nodes in a field whose currents pushed and pulled at them in ways that had nothing to do with muscle. Jon stepped in and out of the law of the ring, finding the places where it was thinner, thicker, where there were seams to use like a craftsman uses the grain of wood. He felt foolish for the thought even as he trusted it. The world had a grain. He had always known it when he was quiet enough. The Night King raised the staff and struck the ground. Frost shot along the earth like snakes and reared up at the circumference, testing it. The boundary hardened. The frost recoiled and then shattered into dust. The creature raised the staff again, and for a half-breath Jon saw the exact future of that motion. The place where the blow would fall, the tiny shift in weight that would make the difference between parry and break. And he stepped not where the man he had been would have stepped, but where the man he meant to become would place his foot. Longclaw swung. The staff met it. The world shouted once, inside the ring. Later, men would say that they felt the shout in their teeth. Later, Sam would write that the sound had resonance in a part of the brain he had always suspected was older than written language. Later, no one would agree on exactly when hope had entered the field like a messenger too thin to notice until it was already there. In the moment, there was only breath and the feeling of something giving way that had not given way in a very long time. Jon pressed. He pressed with everything he had and also with something else, something that was not his but which had been lent to him by a tree that remembered the shape of men who kept their word. He felt the Night King's attention sharpen in response and then, not falter but adjust, as if some distant calculation had flickered and produced a different sum. The creature brought the staff up to guard and did not strike. It watched him. It watched the man. He lowered Longclaw an inch to acknowledge the moment without enjoying it. The staff lowered in mirror. The ring held. The cold held. Dawn pushed harder at the edge of the world. A finger of gray tracing the line of the hills until the snow there was not silver but merely white. Outside the circle, people remembered they had bodies. They shifted. They coughed. Daenerys' breath plumed and she watched it go with a small, almost childish wonder, as if she were seeing her life as a visible thing for the first time. Sansa's hands were empty and that was its own discipline. Arya rolled her shoulders minutely to keep them ready. Bran was somewhere else and precisely here. His eyes were dark wells down which something might have been climbing or falling forever. When his mouth moved, the words that came were his and not his. There was a law that said no victor can own the thing they win, he murmured. Only return it to the balance from which it came. But we forgot. We tried to make winnings into property. We froze them into statues and called them ours. That is why he is here. Jon did not hear the words. The world inside the ring had narrowed to a point so fine it cut time. The Night King moved. Jon met it. They were closer now, as if both had chosen to strip away elegance in favor of what would serve. Longclaw made small, hard shapes. The staff answered with shorter and shorter circles. A flake of rime drifted between them, suspended in a current that did not exist, and turned slowly like a coin deciding which face to show. The staff struck John's scar and sent lightning through old pain. He grunted and twisted, letting the old hurt pull him out of a line that would have taken his ear and half his jaw. He came back in with a cut that was less a blow than a sentence finishing itself. The staff slid, trapped, and in that half-second, John saw the line that had been invisible since he had stepped into the ring. He took it. Longclaw rose, fell, rose again. Not wild, not brave, just exact. As exact as a man can be who knows that a single miscount ends more than his own day. Steel found the place on the creature's skull where fracture had become a plan. The staff struck him in the kidney so hard he tasted copper. He completed the cut. The crown of horned frost sheared away in a spray that the ring drank and made nothing of. The thing standing before him, now unhelmed, did not look more human. It did not look less. It looked inevitable in a way that made John's hands shake for the first time. A sound rose at the edge of hearing. It wasn't the whites. It wasn't the living. It was the wind, remembering a melody it had learned when the world had been young. The Night King lifted its empty hand and made a small gesture, a gesture no larger than the one a teacher makes when telling a child to continue. John continued. He did not howl. He did not think. He reduced the distance between necessity and motion to nothing. Longclaw went to work on the thing's neck the way a craftsman finishes an edge he knows will be asked to cut generations. The staff beat at him, beat the breath out of him, beat a bruise that would flower violet and black down his entire side if he lived to see it. But he stayed in the line he had found. The blade bit deeper where the first bite had weakened bone that was not bone. There was no blood. There was a sound like the sea being pulled through a narrow throat of rock. Then there was a breaking, not of the creature alone. The ring itself sang a single, pure note and snapped. The snap did not mean it failed. It meant it finished. The law lifted like a lid. The air crashed down on them, carrying the weight of every withheld voice, every unscreamed scream. Outside, men half fell forward as a pressure they had not noticed eased. The Night King staggered without dignity, and that was the most human thing it had done. It put its hand to its throat and did not find a place to press. It looked at John, really looked, and if an expression could be carved on something that had never worn one, then this was it. Not fear, not anger. An appraisal that had reached a summit did not dispute. It began to fall. In the very long, very short moment between the beginning of the fall and the end of it, John had time to think one thought so loud it drowned everything else. If this was all that was needed, then why did the world talk so much? The Night King struck the ground and broke into a dust that blew away not like debris but like a sigh. The wind took it. The circle, which no longer was a circle, held the memory of a boundary for a heartbeat and then let it go. Silence is a hard thing to keep in a hall or a yard. In a god's wood it can keep itself for a while. The silence after the fall was not emptiness. It was a full room with temporary vacancies. It was bodies remembering to send messages to one another, of blood pacing back through vessels, of nerves reporting with delayed astonishment that they were not on fire. Then, somewhere beyond the trees, something fell that had been standing but had no right to, and its collapse went outward like a ring in a pool after a stone. Far off to the east, men on a wall older than memory felt as if a hand had lifted from the back of their necks. To the west, in a robbed grave, bones that had been moving stopped and lay down with relief so profound it seemed almost audible. In the north, a white bear that had been hunting without hunger sank to its knees and turned its head as if to listen to snow melt. The fall traveled. The world took a long, hitching breath that tasted of iron and pine and something else, something like sleep. John stood with Longclaw point down in the earth again because that is what a man does when he has cut what needed cutting and yet hasn't finished anything so much as reached an ending of one chapter and has no idea what the next will ask. His thigh burned. His ribs ached in cold fire. His hands shook now that the law had lifted, and no, one could mistake it for a trick of the ring. He breathed, lost, found, breathed again. Daenerys reached him first, not because she ran faster than the others, but because the path through air to him seemed to open for her. She put her hands on either side of his face and looked at him as if memorizing a piece of text that men would copy wrong if she did not carry it whole in her head. Exact, she said, a little wonderingly, as if tasting her own word and finding it more than she had hoped. He huffed, half laugh, half expulsion of the last breath that had belonged to the fight. "Help me stand," he said, discovering as he said it that he was still standing. Tormund bellowed something that had too many consonants and too much joy to translate. Brienne let go a sound that might have been a laugh if laughter could be shaped like gratitude. Davos put his head in his hands, and when he lifted it again there were wet tracks that had nothing to do with melt. Tyrion, who had not drunk, lifted his flask and took a single, precise swallow he would remember years later with affection. Sansa came and folded him into a hug so unstark in its open, public hunger that the room of the world rearranged itself to make space for it. Arya stood just close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her, which she would deny having, and she gave the smallest nod that any man had ever been permitted to receive. Sam pressed the leather and its rock against Jon's chest as if it were a talisman that needed to be returned to its place after a rite. "You did it," he said, as if he were writing a line and needed to be very careful with his pen, not to blot. Jon wanted to say no, not yet, not until we know how far the fall falls. He wanted to say he had been something other than himself for a moment, and that was either beautiful or dangerous or both. He wanted to say nothing, so he said nothing and let the living speak for him. He let their voices fill the godswood. He let Ghost lean his weight against his knee and press his cold nose into Jon's palm and hold it there. The trees listened. The face in the heart tree did not change, because it was made to remember, not to approve. The wind went soft in branches that had been brittle a moment before. It was not done. Nothing of this size is ever done in a single stroke. What snarls around a world will not agree to undress in a minute. Men would ride out and find pockets where the bond held, stubborn as grief in an old house. They would find remnants moving without orders, and they would break those remnants with steel now that the binding hand had been cut. They would argue about what had been purchased and at what cost and who would be allowed to write the story of it in ink that could not be washed out. They would do what the living always do when death loosens its hold a little. They would live louder for a while, and then they would begin to forget, because forgetting is a kind of mercy that keeps the day moving. But for now, in the slow bruise of winter's dawn, Jon Snow stood among those he had served and bled for and complicated and loved, and he felt present. The shard at his chest was a small, dumb weight. The cloak at his shoulders warmed him because it was warm, and because it was Sansa's work, and because the North knows how to sew a man into his place as gently as it knows how to turn him out of it if he cannot answer for himself. He sheathed Longclaw with hands that wanted to continue. The blade slid home with a satisfaction that could have been his or the sword's. He turned to the heart tree and bowed his head, not as a supplicant and not as a victor, but as someone who had taken the old law at its word and been met by it halfway. "Thank you," he said, and felt childish for it and did not care. Bran's voice came thin and ordinary now, a boy's through winter air. "He was made to end a story," he said. He didn't know there were others after. Jon looked at him and felt an ache that had not much to do with the spear's strike. "What happens now?" Bran's eyes were grave as windows full of storm. "Winter has other mouths," he said. "This one is quiet. For now." The wind changed, bringing with it scents that had been shut out. Horse, iron, dense smoke, singed fat. The woolly musk of men and women who had feared and now needed to do something with the fear. The living began to move in task lines. Orders were given. Water was heated. Bread emerged from ovens as if the world had been waiting in the flowered dark for its permission to rise. Daenerys took Jon's hand, and for a moment the simple human act might have been the most radical thing that had occurred under those branches. "Eat," she said. "Then we will speak." "About crowns," Tyrion said, unable to help himself and not trying to. He held up a hand at the look he received from three directions. "Later, after bread, after sleep." Sansa smiled without showing teeth. "After funerals," she said. "For even a foe made only of winter has left us a dead to put right, and a dead in us to quiet." Arya reached into her sleeve and produced a small, flat stone with a hole worn through it. She pressed it into Jon's hand alongside Sam's leather, wordless. It was the kind of charm a child ties to a kite string to feel the pull better in their palms. He closed his fingers around it and felt how a hole through a thing could make it lighter, not weaker. Ghost got up and shook himself, snow flying like reclaimed feathers. He put his head back and howled once, not long. In the distance, other voices answered, wild and relieved and very much alive. The sound went up into the lightning sky and spread its note thin across the white. Jon walked out of the God's Wood at last with the others. Day took their faces and showed them to each other in truer colors. The dead had fallen in places he would need to see. The living were standing in places he would need to fill. His leg hurt, his side hurt worse. He loved and was loved and could feel the places where those facts pressed against the grain of the world and made heat. Behind him, the heart tree watched the path. His eyes did not dry. His mouth did not speak. It remembered. The old law had been fed. The new day, which was not new at all, opened itself like a blunt knife being slid back into its sheath. Winter was not finished. Neither was he. He went to bread, to counsel, to what would be asked next. The snow fell as it always had, and changed its meaning, as it always did, by the light men chose to walk through it with. Bread was dense and warm enough to steam his fingers. Jon broke it and did not hurry, chewing as if teeth had a second purpose beyond breaking and the body had to remember it. The table had been dragged nearer the hearth in the little hall beyond the great one, a place used for smaller councils, its beams low and furred with old soot. Fat hissed in a pan. Someone had burned onions to sweetness and then thrown in the last of last autumn's dried herbs. There were bowls. There was salt. The ordinary asserted itself with stubborn grace. Davos sat close enough to the heat to soften his old scars and far enough to give them their privacy. He ate with a soldier's neatness, spoon scraping the bottom of his bowl with the same economy Jon had brought to the ring. Tyrion drank small water and nursed his single swallow of wine as if it were a book he was not finished reading. Sansa ate little, mostly broth, the spoon returning to the bowl after every sip as if taking the measure of how much remained. Arya made the kitchen girl who had been hovering sit and eat beside her. The girl cried without sound for 3 spoonfuls and then stopped crying and began to breathe properly. Daenerys broke bread with the steadiness of someone who had learned long and late to show no hunger in front of watching eyes. She passed a share to Missandei and another to Grey Worm and then another to Jon without looking at him, as if the act of distribution could stand in for something harder and more tender. He accepted his portion and found he could meet her eyes only after he had salted it. The gesture had given him time to grow a small shell around the need inside his chest. "News," Sansa said when the first heat of hunger had cooled to the quiet work of digestion. "Not rumor if you can help it." Gendry had come in with ash along his cheekbone like a war mark he hadn't noticed. He set down a plate of meat that had been coaxed from a creature more bone than flesh and looked embarrassed that there was not more of it. "Some of the dead just fell," he said. "Most of them. The ones in the yard, the ones in the fields. The ones that were wearing our faces. When we went to fetch water from the well near the hunter's house, there was an old woman walking in circles, slower and slower, and then," he stopped. "She lay down, like a tired child. She'd been dead 2 winters. Davos wiped his mouth and set his spoon aside. "That'll be happening where we can't see as well," he said. "In the woods, in the hills. We'll have to send men with sense to check the hollows. No glory in it. A deal of mercy in it." He looked at Jon. "And some won't have gotten the word. The bindings fail in their own time once you cut the knot," Bran said from the doorway. He had Ghost with him. The wolf's shoulder pressed companionably against the boy's knee as if to borrow steadiness or lend it. Bran's voice had a caught-in-the-cupboard sound, a thing that had been thinking its thoughts in a small space and had to get used to air again. Places that were thick with it, places where stories were made and repeated, those will hold. They'll whine and live longer. They'll need cutting by hand. Sansa's spoon paused and went on. "Then we cut them," she said. "We cut them and we burn them and we take their names if they have names and put them away again. We do our work. We also reckon with a morning that dawned on more than Winterfell, Tyrion said softly. If what fell did so across the north, then it fell south too. If it fell on the Blackwater, in the Riverlands, in the Vale, on the Hellholtz Flats, there will be fear unmoored from its cause. Men will choose stories to mend it. The one who writes the first will be believed first. Daenerys took that the way a commander takes a report. Then we write, she said. But we don't lie. We speak of this law. Her gaze glanced, quick and involuntary, toward Bran, as if to include him. And how we met it. We name the North's courage and the sacrifices made. She set her bread down. And we tell them we come. Sansa's eyes moved to the corner of the table, to a place where Ned Stark's hand would have rested if he were here. Her jaw softened and set with a single breath. Yes, she said, and we tell them what we need. Timber, oats, salt meat, leathers, and trust, Missandei added. Her voice was a soft instrument and yet it carried. Which is not asked in letters, Lady Sansa. It is given to what is seen. Each thing you do now will be watched, not only by the North. Arya leaned back, chair on two legs, balance held with a foot hooked under the bench. Then they can watch us burn our dead properly and feed our living and not set our swords to each other's throats in the yard while the pyres are hot. The pyres are ready, Gendry said, clearing his throat. We had a lot of wood stacked against a day that might not come. It came. Jon drank. He tasted onion and heat. He glanced at Sam, who had taken a place near the end of the table and was trying very hard to be mostly book in hand and less man for the moment. We'll use words that don't offend your trees, he said. It was not a question. Sam looked relieved and harried and eager all at once. There's more leeway than we think, he said. The old and the new aren't enemies unless we make them so. If you speak from the root and not just the leaf they hear, words told true aren't a blasphemy. Bran's mouth curved, a ghost of some ancient mischief that had lived in him before crowns and crows and laws. The trees have heard worse, he said. They've heard men say they were the first snow and the last sun and the only river worth naming, and they did not crack. Daenerys' eyes found Jon's in the small hum around the table. She had a way of looking that made the space between lookers into a path a person could walk. After, she said. We speak after. He nodded because the word was correct and because the shape of it fit what he could hold at the moment. After. Bread. Fire. Names. Then the other work. They held the funerals under a sky that had finally remembered it was allowed to be blue. Not bluer than winter ever permits, but blue enough to make the breath turn a little sweeter and the pupil open to catch what it could. They stacked wood measured and high, leaning the dead in their linen against each other so that when the first took flame, the flame could be shared. Names were spoken by those who knew them, and when a name could not be found, a word was used instead. Brother, sister, herdsman, girl. And that was enough. Davos read the words he had learned first for a boy called Matthias on a rock beside a sea that drowned men and then spat them out for the gulls, changing the names and keeping the sorrow. The old gods were given their silence, and the seven their speeches, and the mother and the father their share of petition and thanks. And the stranger, too, received a touch to the cheek of the air. When Jon put a torch to the edge of a pyre that had 3 men he had joked with and a woman whose name he did not know but whose laugh he had heard in the yard more than once, the fire broke like sleep, sudden and absolute. Heat pushed at his face. Tears took the choice from some who would otherwise have withheld them. Smoke carried a bakery's yeast and a battlefield's salt and something else that men will always pretend has no sweetness in it for fear of what sweetness means. Theon stood with Bran's chair and did not bow his head. He kept his eyes on the flames with such hard steadiness that it was a kind of honoring. Sansa came to his side and stood close enough that their arms touched. Neither flinched. Arya wandered the perimeter like a dog checking fences, finding and fixing small failures. There a boy who had no wood for his mother and would not ask. Here a log placed wrong that needed turning lest it fall and make more grief. When the smoke made the air into a bowl and pressed on the lungs of the living. When the last of the names were said. When the people began to turn from the heat toward the hungry work of after. Jon found himself walking toward the crypts without deciding to. The tunnel down was slick with melt and old damp. Torches held out at intervals made the stone faces of Stark lords into bands of light and dark, men whose carved eyes looked not mournful but obstinate. Jon's breath ran ahead of him and came back cooler, the way it does when there is not enough room for all of it to pass at the same time. Ghost went without a sound, a pale slice of intent. He found Ned's stone and sat the way a son sits when he intends to speak to a father whose counsel he can imagine so completely that the imagining is nearly enough. His thigh throbbed with a precise ache, no longer numbed by the ring's old law. The leather around his neck was damp with sweat. The shard of obsidian lay flat against his chest, a small foreign country. "I didn't lie," he said to the stone. It felt important to begin there. It felt like meeting the old law with one of his own. Not today. He couldn't say the same for yesterday or tomorrow. He didn't try. He placed Longclaw across his knees and let the weight of it settle and then vanish into the old familiarity of the pose. "I thought when I was a boy that right was a straight path," he said. "You said as much sometimes. Or I thought you did. But sometimes right is all bends and hedges, and if you walk straight you end up in a ditch and the crows laugh. Today was straight. I want to remember what that feels like." The stone said nothing. Beneath it, in the long inheritance of bones, the last air that had touched Ned Stark's lungs had been replaced by rock and damp and the slow patience of earth. Somewhere above them, in a small room, Sansa was likely counting sacks. Somewhere nearer, Tyrion was sharpening words on a whetstone of strategy that did not care whose hand held it. Somewhere in a chamber that had no warmth until she entered it, Daenerys was unfastening armor and not thinking about the way her hands shook. "I will not own what I won," he said into the cool. "I heard it. Bran said it and I heard it." He thought of how easily his name would fit into a song if he let it, how simple it would be to stand on a wall and let the cheers wash the blood off his hands. "I will carry it." Ghost lay down with his head on his paws and gave a sigh that would have been called too human by men who do not know the ways animals let the world through them. Bran's chair wheels whispered behind him when Jon had not heard the boy come. The boy did not announce himself. He watched the stone with a face that might have been reading a history written on it in ink only he could see. "Do you envy him?" Jon asked, startled by the candor of the question he'd spoken. "No," Bran said, with the mildness that meant his answer would be sharp around the edges. He had what he could hold. Then it was taken and he held that. He did not envy the past while he was living in his present. "I envy that sometimes. Not him." Jon let a breath out and let it go all at once, not in little gusts. "There's more to do." Bran nodded. "Always. That is the bad news and the good. The knot you cut will not admit to being cut in all the places where it kept itself. It will be a long time becoming string. Some of it will never forgive us. Us. You. The tree. The line between." Bran placed his hand on the stone where a direwolf had been carved with exaggerated shoulders, its muzzle pointed north. "What you did changes the story. That never goes without a price." "What price?" Bran's mouth twitched. "You will find that places where hunger once ruled will require you to make new rules," he said. "It is a tiresome price. Also, some will say that because you used a law older than theirs to protect them, you owe them the courtesy of not using your victory to put a crown on your head. They will be right and wrong." "That sounds like everyone," Jon said, and almost smiled. Bran didn't. "You will be asked to be language," he said. "That is more difficult than being steel." They emerged from the crypts into a day that had learned its own light. The pyres had been worked down and tended. The hearths had been banked. The path to the yard had been sanded with crushed gravel so that men didn't slide when their knees went weak. Sansa and Daenerys stood on the outer steps of the keep at an angle to one another, not confrontational, this was not theater, but not yet learned into an easy line either. Missandei was a steady presence at her queen's shoulder, not so much guard as promise. Behind Sansa, Brienne had taken a place that acknowledged both her oath and the woman she had chosen to become loyal to. Positions said truths without needing mouths. They came together, the four of them, not standing in a square but moving along the gentle curve that people make when they are willing to be changed by standing near someone else. "The lords will want to assemble," Sansa said. "They'll want to see the living standing together." "We'll let them," Daenerys said. "And we'll set the work lists," Sansa went on. "We'll have to ration salt and flour. We'll have to decide who gets the first wave of any of boots." "Not I," Tyrion murmured, looking down at his very good boots with exaggerated affection. Sansa glanced at him and did not humor him with a smile. She did not punish him with a frown. "We have a garden of dead things stored in the cold," she said to Jon without looking away from Daenerys. "They'll feed us until the first thaw. After that, it will be ugly." "Ugly we can survive," Jon said. "We cannot survive pretty lies." Daenerys' head tilted. The gesture had a hint of the young woman she had been in a city where the walls were painted with the gold of a promise she had not then understood. "Then no lies," she said. "We tell them I will not take their last egg or their last daughter to win a throne. We tell them the Iron Throne is not worth a single northern child's knees going blue in the cold." Sansa's chin rose half an inch. "It never was." Something in Tyrion's face nodded the tiniest degree at that and then nodded again in a different place. "It may be worth the right arithmetic on the right day, though," he said. "If this morning fell on Cersei too, she'll be feeling the walls of her world with new hands. She will make a show of generosity where it buys her 2 coins worth for 1 coin spent. Or she will harden. It depends on who speaks first in her chambers tonight." "Jaime," Brienne said, so quietly that the name didn't carry beyond their small cluster. She did not blush as she might once have done at saying it. She did not look at Tyrion. She watched a point somewhere above the yard where smoke met sky. If he has learned how to speak to her without thinking of the boy he was. Daenerys looked at the tall knight with a strange tenderness that had nothing to do with armor or vows and everything to do with a woman recognizing another woman's private ledger. "If he has learned that," she said, "I would like to speak to him." She turned to Jon. "But first, pockets." He nodded. "Bran says there are places where it held. We go. Small group, quiet, not to be heroes, to be men and women doing a job." Davos arrived as if the words had been an order shouted down a line. "I'll get the sleds ready and men who know the land," he said. "I'd say take 30, split them into 3 tens. 1 with you, 1 with Tormund, 1 with Brienne if she'll consent to the cold biting her pretty blue steel." Brienne's mouth did that small line that might become a smile under the right weather. "It is only a color because of the north," she said, as if that explained and forgave. "I'll take the wildlings," Tormund said from behind them, having appeared the way big men sometimes do, suddenly and with no witness to their approach. "We know where the snow goes to hide." He clapped Jon on the shoulder with exuberant gentleness. "And I want to poke a dead thing with a spear and have it lay down and apologize to me for the trouble." Arya looked at Jon in that sidelong way she had when the word she meant to say was ready and she was testing to see if the world was. He nodded. She said it. "I'm taking 10 and going to the barrows east of the Flayed Man's old road. That place has the smell of a knot." Bran's eyes flicked up and down. A single swallow in a throat that didn't need water. "It does," he said. Daenerys ran her tongue along her teeth and made her decision not with a flourish but with a quiet click. "Grey Worm will hold Winterfell with the Unsullied and the North's levy," she said. "Missandei will send letters in my name and in yours, Lady Sansa, and in the King in the North's." She paused, and the word was a testing of law as much as a title. "If that still holds." Sansa did not bridle. "I aim to keep my people fed and alive," she said. "If we do that while men argue about crown words, we'll have done what the crown is for. We can call it what we like later." Jon breathed and felt relief enter like a guest given a chair by a disciplined host. "Later," he said. The word did not mean putting off forever. It meant binding the present tight enough that it would not slip and undo their work. They rode within the hour, because men who have been asking their bodies to hold still for more than a day develop an itch under the skin that only motion can ease. The snow had a crust to it that broke under a boot at intervals like an apology and then bore the weight again. The sky had thin, high clouds like the ribs of something too big to imagine. Wolves had left prints where they had crossed from cover to cover without wasting themselves in the open. John took 10. Davos, 2 of the old hands from Castle Black whose names he knew only by the shape of their beards. A girl from White Harbor whose fishing knife had been her father's and whose horse had a mean sense of humor. A man from Deepwood. A wildling woman with a scar like a second mouth at her brow and laughter that came out like a bark. Gendry to carry hot stones and tools, and Sam, who insisted with such un-Sam-like firmness that refusing him would have been an insult to the man he had become. Ghost padded near Jon's knee when the trees allowed it and farther out when the land needed a scout. They went toward a copse Bran had pointed at without looking at a map. There, he'd said, eyes on something far away. Where the land remembers a boy who died lying to a girl and a man who killed his father in a hall built too narrow for his dreams. Things tangle where men make stories of themselves. Davos had looked at Bran with that squinting half-resentment. He sometimes leveled at boys who spoke like gods. "Aye," he'd said drily, "and because there's a low place where the wind goes round and round and the dead ain't got sense enough to step out of it." They found the copse at mid-afternoon, the light pale as if it had been straining through milk. The trees made a ring by accident. No children had cut them into a circle. Roots had simply met and agreed. In its center lay a bulge of ground like a sleeping animal. The air had a thinness to it, hard to name, the way a room does when words are about to be said that will change the way people consider the furniture. The wildling woman with the scar spat thoughtfully into her palm and rubbed it into her hair. "Feels like a winter wife's breath," she said. "Cold, and then colder if you breathe it too long." Sam's hand was already on his book, and then it was off his book because he remembered in time that no page would help him with the knowing he had to do here. "Listen," he said. "I know we say that all the time, but listen." They listened. There are silences that are merely the absence of noise, a gap waiting to be filled with a child's laugh or a pan's clatter. There are silences that have an agenda. This was the second kind. It seemed to ask them to make the first move and promise to make a copy of whatever they gave it and hand that back to them later, changed. "Not the ring," Davos said under his breath. "No law here. No thing to bind it that we could make in a morning. Just the ghost of a law that got stretched too thin." Jon dismounted and held the reins in one hand. The horse stood, ears flicking in a rhythm that had been evolved to find tigers in grasses that had never grown here. Jon put his thumb to the obsidian shard and felt the dull comfort of it. Presence. He walked into the copse. The others followed at distances that told their different tolerances for magic. Gendry close enough to lend muscle without pretending he understood. Davos a yard back, honoring the old man's rule to stand where the arrow would hit after the prince. Sam near enough to feel included and far enough to look. Ghosts so near Jon that their shadows were one when the sun remembered to show them. At the hump's crown lay a mess of old branches and new drifts and bones that had been gnawed by things that had not been cold. In and among it, the first fingers of green dared up, wintergrass that had found some meager warmth from buried rot. Through it all threaded a smell like iron in a cup left to rust full of rain. Jon knelt, the ache in his thigh sharpened like a tension. He did not open his sword. He ran his gloved hand over the surface of the hump until he found a hollow he had not seen. He pressed his palm into it. It fit. The ground pressed back as if a hand had risen to meet his. The air went very still, and then it did not. His breath came and did not rise in steam. He smelled the smell of his own cottage in the winter of his boyhood. The unwashed wool, the rushes that needed changing, the dog that had chosen him. He heard, for a heartbeat, his father's voice as close as an ear and as far as the ice. He said the words he had said in the Godswood, not all of them, just the ones he had found as his own. "I am Jon," he said. "I am the man who cut the knot. I am not here to own your ending. I am here to unfasten your long and careful dying." Davos' breath came out in a sound like a tide giving up reluctantly.
Sam's shoulders loosened.
Gendry blinked hard and later could not say why. The hump shivered. Not much. Enough that the fragile green trembled and the dead branches knocked tiny clinks together like poor men's bells. Ghost's ears went back and he growled. Not as a warning, but as a statement. The ground settled again, lower. The air let them breathe. John stood with difficulty. His leg declared itself his again with stabs of opinion, and stepped back. They dug. There was no way around that. The world had dignity that demanded a little labor. They used shovels where they could and their hands where the dirt was too alive with root to allow it. They found skulls, a fox's nest long abandoned, a coin with a face erased, an iron ring that had once bound something to something else and then had been asked for more than iron can give. Sam took the ring in his hand and closed his fingers around it, and when he opened them again his palm bore a perfect circle of black as if the iron had left its mark in gratitude. When they reached the center, the place the tangle had made itself around, there was no treasure and no obvious sin. There was an old child's toy, 2 wooden figures with arms that swung on a peg. A man and a woman, if the carving could be read that way. Their faces were worn to nothing by play. John lifted it as gently as if a child's hand still might reach. He held it up, and the cops exhaled. The ground sank flat with a sigh that did not come from any throat and all of them at once. The air lost that thin, mean intelligence it had had. A crow called not far off. The wintergrass stood as if pleased with a joke it had told itself. John put the toy back on the earth where it would rot and feed the next life. He patted the place, absurd and then not absurd at all. Davos laughed under his breath, something nearly like joy. The wildling woman slapped the trunk of the nearest tree with the flat of her hand and shouted a single word of her old tongue that had the sound of thanks and of telling someone to mind their manners. They burned the bones they had found with the dry branches and sang a poor, low song that a sailor taught and a smith's wife changed and a girl from White Harbor carried to the north. And if it had no right to be beautiful, it was beautiful anyway. When the flame was done, when only a little heat hung over the pit like a thought someone did not want to let go of, they filled it in and tamped it and set a small cairn that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't been there and everything to them. 2 hills over, in a different ring of trees, men with Brienne found a tangle of chain and old oath swearing that had held dead things upright in spite of time. They cut the chains and spoke, and the dead folded. Brienne later would say it was the kindest work she had ever done with a sword and the most exhausting. Tormund's 10 chased a wine of winter to a ravine where wind chased its tail and tossed snow back upon itself until there was a kind of play in it. He went down into it and cursed and shouted and laughed and came back with a shoulder full of frost as if he had wrestled it. It said sorry, he told his men, and they laughed and believed him. They returned at dusk the color of pewter and bread. Winterfell's walls looked less suspicious of them at a distance than they had in the morning. That was a trick of light and love. The yard smelled of meat and work. Missandei had not stopped moving all day and now stood with a tray of ink bowls, her sleeves rolled, the bones of her wrist delicate and strong. The letters she had sent had been to lords who would scoff and to river fishers who would cry and to a woman who had once held Daenerys by the elbow and said, "Not here, not now," and saved her life by making her wait. A raven from the Vale had returned with a reply already. The little lord of the Eyrie had told them he was composing a poem and also sending oats. Sansa had acquired a smudge of flour on her cheek. She did not know it. She stood amid a movable city of lists and pressed wax seals and payments, and the way people's eyes change when they are told yes or told no and are within their rights to both praise and hate you for it. When she saw Jon come in at the head of his 10, her shoulders dropped a half-inch and lifted again, as if she had been shouldering a weight for him and would continue to but was glad to share it for a minute. Daenerys appeared without ceremony from somewhere that had not existed until she entered it. She had changed into a wool dress that had nothing to do with show and everything to do with the fact that silk freezes cruelty into the skin. Her hair had been unbound and rebound by hands that were not hers. She endured the small intimacy of that as a queen endures the tightening of straps. She looked tired and young and older than her years in a way that was not tragic but true. They met in the little hall with fewer people than had eaten there at noon. The longer a day grows, the more it wishes to be pruned.
Tyrion, Davos, Sam, Missandei, Grey Worm, Sansa, Arya, Brienne, Tormund, Gendry, Tian, Bren.
The room held all their breaths without fogging the walls. "They'll come to us," Tyrion said, lifting the veil letter. "Some to take shelter, some to offer it." Some to ask for our armies in the spring. In spring, Davos echoed, as if testing the word on his tongue to see if any teeth were missing. Aye, if the rivers run and the mud allows it. There's salt for 3 weeks at half ration, Sansa said. There's wheat for 2 if we pretend hard and eat quietly. There's barley for longer if we can stomach drinking it. We can send to White Harbor, Theon said unexpectedly. His voice had a new steadiness to it, something hammered into him that would not bend to please cruelty anymore. We can send to the Iron Islands. My sister. He stopped and breathed as if remembering that in this room his sister might be alive in the way that matters. Yara will give what can be spared. I will go if you ask it. Sansa nodded with quick gratitude. I ask it. Not tonight. Before the week is out. I'll go with him to the harbor, Arya said, before anyone could decide to tell her not to. There are things that need watching on that road that will not show themselves to men wearing mail. Brienne's jaw worked once. She did not gainsay. I will accompany my lord, and here she glanced at Jon and not at any southern title in the room. To the Barrows West tomorrow. There are a few more days of that work yet. Missandei set her tray down and lifted her hands to tuck a curl behind her ear. Ink had stained her fingers into an elegance men would write poems about. I have word from the Stormlands, she said. The men there have had their dead fall as well. They have had... She searched for a Westerosi word that would tell the truth without inviting insult. They have had a very difficult morning. Lord Gendry. She smiled at him a little and watched him startle, then straighten. You will be written to. Be ready. Gendry rubbed the back of his neck with an awkward pride that made Arya's mouth twitch as if she had bitten something too sweet on purpose. I'll send back the right words, he muttered, mostly to himself. Or ask someone who knows which ones are right. Grey Worm had been silent for most of the day, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had been using words mostly in the form of orders. Unsullied can hold, he said now, simple as a table set with bread and salt. We will not break when men shout. We will not die because food is less. Tormund slapped the table with a hand that would have broken a lesser board. And we will leave, he said cheerfully, at odds with the word. Some of us. When you've trimmed the worst of the dead out of the ground and the small ones have learned their names again, we'll take who wants to go and we'll go north. It belongs to us whether it wants to or not. We will make it want to. Take as many of the dragonglass spearheads as we can spare, Jon said. Leave some here for the pockets that don't know they're beaten. Take some for your wolves. Tormund chuckled and tipped his head toward Ghost. Those are yours, he said. Ours are uglier and less polite. He sobered. You'll come north again. It was not a question. Jon didn't answer because there was no answer that would not make a promise he could not own. He looked to Bran, who was watching a point in the air just beyond the tallest beam as if something were riding it like a slow fish. Bran blinked and returned to them with an effort so small it made the heart ache. What I can see keeps changing, he said. That is good. It means we can change it. There is a place on the eastern coast where the ice learned to speak in a voice that men mistook for a god. There is a lake in the west that remembers a grief that is not its own. There is a village under the shadow of a hill carved with men's faces that was taught to be cruel for so long that it will need us to teach it to be tired. He paused. And there is the south. Tyrion slipped his flask back into his belt. The south is not a place, he said. It is an appetite. It will want to eat you, Sansa said, not unkindly, to Daenerys. It will praise your rescue and then ask for your bones. Daenerys did not flinch. Then we will feed them bread first, she said, and ask for theirs. The council, like all councils, dissolved not when everyone was satisfied, but when no one could add anything that would not cheapen what had been said. They left in knots, the way families divide themselves to do chores after a death. Some went to their beds to close their eyes and see the day in redness behind the lids. Some went to the yard to move bodies that had not made it to the pyre and needed another reckoning. Some went to places they did not know they were going until they had arrived at them. Sansa to the kitchen door where the girl Arya had fed had taken up a knife to chop onions with the stiff, proud determination of the newly brave. Davos to a tiny corner of the wall where a draft came through that would tell him if the wind wheeled in the night. Tyrion to a bench where he could look at nothing and think about everything. Jon took blood-warm water and cloth and cleaned his side where the spear had kissed him. The skin was bruised and had a white line that would be a long memory later. He washed his thigh and found the puncture clean and neat, the way a wound might be if the world had been invited to cut you. He sat very still until the shaking that had wanted his hands all day finally came to collect its debt, and he let it have his hands and not his mind. Ghost put his head in Jon's lap and endured the trembling as if it were anew whether he would wait out with his man. Daenerys knocked once on the door and did not wait for our permission. She entered and shut it and leaned back against it as if she had traveled a great distance to arrive at wood and latch. "You should be with your people," Jon said, and immediately felt the foolishness of thinking there was a group on earth that did not contain her. She smiled very slowly. "I am," she said. Then, because she was tired and therefore honest. "And I wanted a minute where I am only a woman." He sought for words that were not coins to pay for his relief at seeing her. "If this is that minute," he said, "we should waste it." He stood awkwardly, not favoring his leg because pride has habits and pain is a teacher who does not mind repetition. He crossed the small distance between them and put his hand on the door beside her head and the other on the small of her back where the wool had warmed to her. He did not kiss her at once. They stood, not breathing so that they might hear breathing, not moving so that movement would be true when it came. She closed the last inch and his mouth found hers. The kiss was not the wildness of a man who has killed a king and a woman who has carried dragons. It was the quiet that comes after the middle watch when you know the dawn will come and your bones begin to trust you again. It was a kiss that did not promise anything and therefore could keep everything. They parted with reluctance and ease. "Exact," she said against his cheek, and laughed once, surprised at herself. "Tomorrow I'll be clumsy to balance it," he said, and she snorted elegant. "I will be cruel to a man who thinks he can buy me with soybeans," she said. "It will make the next thing you ask of me easier to swallow." He sobered. "We will have to ask hard things." "We will." She looked at his thigh with frank disapproval, the way a commander looks at a map marked with a weak point. "Sleep. I will not lie awake beside you counting the ways we might die tomorrow." He touched her knuckles where she had lifted her hand to smooth his hair and found a stubborn curl he had never known he possessed. She allowed the indulgence and then left, and he watched the door after it had closed as if the crack between it and the jamb might have something more to say. He dreamed. He dreamed of running through snow so new it squeaked with delight under his weight. He dreamed of the ring, not as a visible line but as a pressure in the earth that held when men asked it to and refused to be owned. He dreamed of the Night King's face without face and felt not triumph but a sorrow so old it tasted sweet and then bitter and then left only salt. He woke before dawn to the smell of wood smoke and onions again and knew that he could do a day like the one he had done yesterday and that they might have to. In the morning, messengers came heavy as snowbirds with what they had gathered. Some news had the shape of hope the way a river has a shape even under ice. Some had the shape of a fist closed around a throat. Cersei had not yet sent a letter. A man from the Reach had sent 3, each more flowery than the last. The Vale's second letter contained less poetry and more oats. White Harbor promised ships if the ice let them move in 10 days. The Iron Islands sent a raven that had been wounded by a hawk and arrived bleeding on the windowsill. The parchment tied to its leg said only, "We are not winter's servants." Sansa smiled sickly at that, as if at a joke too true. They rode again. Brienne's 10 cut the tangle on the west slopes where men had been taught to take and take again, and where the snow had learned to hold their stubbornness in place. Arya and her 10 slipped among barrows like shadows and found a child's shoe sets of 3, and in a ditch a hand that had held on so long to a broken haft that the wood had become part of bone. She freed the hand and whispered a name no one had taught her but which the ditch seemed to hand to her. Jon took his 10 to a place Bran had called the Lake That Is Not, a low place that froze over without water, and there they spoke and the ice listened and cracked, not loudly but thoroughly. The work was the kind that humbles a man without making him small. It asks him to be patient and precise. He found, to his surprise, that he liked it. On the 4th day, when the pyres had become more ash than architecture, and when the soups were thinner and spiced more cleverly because there was less to hide, a rider came up the king's road from the south with a flag that was not a flag, just a strip of linen tied to a stick. He reeled in the saddle without drama, a man who had been asked too much and had given it with poor grace and no complaint. They took him down and put him before the fire and poured broth into him until some of it stayed. The message he had carried, stitched into the hem of his doublet because a man will guard pouches with his life and forget to guard his hem, said this: "The Golden Company has arrived. The lion purrs. The city is quiet and sharpening its knives. If the dead fell in the capital, and they did, they fell inside houses that were already tombs. Lord Varys sends word that the queen will send word when it suits her. He advises you to speak first." Tyrion held the scrap delicately. "He would," he said fondly, "and not. He is not wrong." Daenerys looked at the fire and saw more than flame. She saw maps moving under hands. She saw a throne she had dreamed of and been told was hers and had learned by pain to doubt. "We will speak," she said. "We will say that the North stood with me and I with the North. We will say that we did not send our dead south when we had them but kept them and burned them with names. We will say that my dragons—" She paused, and that small tremor returned to her jaw. "My dragons stood in the sky and did not burn the ring because I asked them not to. We will ask the South to choose whether it wants to be ruled by someone who held a law or by someone who holds only her fear." Sansa's eyes warmed, briefly. "We will say it together." Jon breathed, and in that breath was bread and smoke and the ghost of a ring under a tree and the weight of a sword on his thigh and a woman's mouth saying the word exact as if she had invented it. He would not own what he had won. He would carry it, and that was heavier and, perversely, more bearable. Before the letter could be penned and tied to any bird's leg, Bran came into the hall with his face full of the weather of the far off. "There is one more place," he said, with the painful gentleness of a boy who brings work to a weary table. "I did not see it because it did not want to be seen. It learned that from men. A mouth of winter in a place where men have called the hill their god and carved its face until it could hear them. There are bones in the hill and oaths in the bones. If we ask long enough, it will answer." "Where?" Jon asked, already tired and already turning toward his cloak. "Near the barrow Arya cleaned," Bran said. "On the other side of the fold. You will know it by the way the snow refuses to rest." They went with fewer this time, not because they had ceased to respect the work, but because sometimes a small hand picks a knot better. Jon took Arya and Davos and Sam and Ghost. The sky had a sheen to it like a blade that had seen use and been wiped, not quite clean. They found the place by absence. The way wind changed its song as if it were being made to perform from a script written by a petty lord. The hill had faces crude and eroded, mouths all open in the slovenly way of carvings made by men who want to see their own teeth in the mouths of gods. Snow slid off the slope and then drifted back, offended at having been moved. Jon put his hand to the stone and felt it, not hard or cold but stubborn. "You have held men's lies," he said softly. "Let go of them now." Nothing moved. The hill had been here before his mouth and would be here after it. Arya put her hand beside his and said nothing at all, and perhaps that was the better prayer. Davos spit into his palm and rubbed his hands together as if there were a rope that needed pulling. Sam took the ring from his pouch again, the iron one that had marked his skin, and set it on the stone the way a man places a cup on a table and asks if anyone will have some. Ghost walked up 3 paces and sat and stared at the hill as if it were an animal pretending to be asleep. The snow trembled, not over the whole slope but at a place halfway up where men's feet had worn a path too mean to be a pilgrimage. Quivered and settled and quivered again. A sound like a sigh made through tight teeth escaped the hill somewhere inside its throat. Jon could almost see the shape of the law here, the refusing to be owned law he had held, the one the Night King had been made from and under. It had been taught to hold the wrong things. He could not remake it. He could ask. He did, with his hand and his breath and his body standing as exactly as he could stand in the cold. The hill took a long time to decide. When it did not give up dramatically. The snow simply stopped being insulted by gravity and lay down. The mouths carved by boastful hands softened. A stone at the base, one that had been used as an altar for vows made under duress and in stupidity, cracked in the middle and then slipped a fraction, and that was somehow worse and better than it shattering. It went back to being rock. Sam picked up the iron ring and laughed once. A little wild. "You can teach a hill," he said. "You can." Davos set a hand on John's shoulder and squeezed hard. "You can ask," he said. "That's what we did. That's what we'll keep doing. Gods help us all." They rode home in half-light that had the color of old pewter rubbed clean with a rough cloth. Winterfell's smoke rose prudent and straight. John's leg hurt. His side muttered. Ghost loped ahead and then back and then ahead again, white on white, visible because he was John's. On the gate, Sansa stood with the wind lifting the edge of her hood just enough to show the hair that had been the last thing some men saw before they died and found it a comfort anyway. Daenerys stood beside her in a cloak that had been made by hands that now smelled of soup and thread. Tyrion had his hands clasped, less from piety than from the conscious decision not to pick up the cup at his elbow. They did not cheer. They breathed out. The breathing out sounded like welcome. The letter to the south was written that evening in a script steady enough to be mistaken for a man who was not tired. It named what had been done and what remained. It did not plead. It invited. It said that the North had stood with the Dragon Queen because she had stood with them when the day asked for standing. It said that a law older than crowns had been given its due, and that whoever would wear a crown must present themselves to older laws with clean hands. It said that bread was being counted and would be shared where it could be. It did not say the word exact. It did not need to. The line of it made the sound. Jon sealed it with the wolf head and Daenerys with the three-headed dragon. Sansa pressed her own signet into the wax like a hand on a child's back to send it on its way. Missandei tied it to the leg of a raven that cocked its head as if reading. The bird went into the night the way a word goes into a mouth that may spit it out or swallow. They watched it go. In the yard, a group of children had made a game of running along the edge of the shadow cast by the keep and not letting themselves fall into it. A boy fell anyway and laughed and climbed out. Arya watched them and did not intervene. Brienne leaned against a post and allowed her face to rest. Davos sat and sharpened a knife that did not need sharpening just to let the rhythm have him for a while. Tormund told a short story to a woman with a scar like a second mouth. A story about a bear who drank ale and then apologized for not sharing. And they laughed like men inside after a storm that has decided to rain itself out offshore. Ghost lay by the heart tree and put his head on his paws. The weirwood did not speak. The ring was gone. The law it had held stood anyway, in men's hands and mouths and the careful way they stepped around each other when they were tired and chose not to make more work. Snow fell as if nothing had happened and remained changed because everything had. Jon stood at the threshold where hall met yard, the place where you can feel both the heat and the cold without choosing yet, and let the pull of both teach him the tightrope he'd been walking since he'd come into the world. He did not envy men who chose only one. He did not despise them either. He went to the table where bread had been set out for those too busy to ask to be fed. He broke a piece into his palm and thought of the way the ground had risen to meet him in the copse, of the way the spear had tasted his ribs and then withdrawn as if surprised to find resistance. He thought of the letter winging south into a city that ate letters for breakfast and men for supper. He thought of a slope somewhere north where a wildling would stand in the bruised light and decide that home could be a place you make by insisting on it. He ate, he chewed, he swallowed, he breathed. He turned toward the next necessary thing. He would not own this day. He would carry it, with a wolf at his side and a law at his back and a woman whose hand had warmed his jaw and a sister who sewed more room into his breath and a friend who put a stone with a hole in it in his palm to make what pulled on him easier to hold. The night came and he went into it.